Thank you, Amelia. Good morning, all. My name is Suzanne Bartels. I'm the director of Hagee Library and Learning Technologies at Guilford College and the chair of the NC Live Outreach, Promotions, and Partnerships Advisory Committee. I'm honored and excited today to welcome our opening keynote speaker, Tracy D Hall, whose presentation entitled "The Alphabet is an Abolitionist, Libraries in the Disruption of Racialized Literacies" could not be more relevant to the theme of this year's conference, Literacy for All. Tracy was appointed the American Library Association's 10th executive director in its 143-year history in February of 2020. In her new role, she oversees the oldest and largest library association in the world, made up of 57,000 members and more than 200 staffers. Tracy is the first woman African-American executive director in ALA's history. Upon her appointment, ALA President Wanda K. Brown observed that, quote, her unique combination of philanthropy and library know-how position her to be the leader ALA needs today. She is optimistic, energizing, and innovative, qualities that will serve the association well as it continues its investments in advocacy, development, and information technology. Tracy has impressive experience in libraries and within ALA. Over the years, she has held positions at Seattle Public Library, New Haven Free Public Library, Hartford Public Library, and Queens Library. In 1998, she was among the first cohort of ALA's Spectrum Scholars, a grant program established to diversify librarianship. She served as the director of ALA's Office for Diversity in the early 2000s and has served on advisory councils for the Institute of Museum and Library Services, also has contributed substantially to the library profession's major publications. We're thrilled that Tracy is here with us today, so please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that kind introduction. And I also want to thank Amelia and just the entire NC Live community for having me. It feels really good to be here. This feels like such a great way to sort of end the week. And I just want to acknowledge that apropos of the conversation that we'll be having this morning, I live on the very far south side of Chicago, and I am working from my home office today. And so I'm experiencing, I think intermittently, a little bit of buffering. And part of that is because we lack robust broadband on the south side of Chicago. In fact, an initiative by the mayor, our Mayor Lori Lightfoot, has just acknowledged that. And you'll see where there has been an acknowledgement of the inequitable investment in broadband in the city and the connection that was made between that inequity and the high death rates and infection rates in regards to COVID-19 that have occurred on the west and the south side of Chicago. And yet, when choosing a place to live in Chicago, it was really important to me that I live and by my residence in a community that is reflective of where I come from and what I fight for. So as we talk, and if there is any buffering, I just want to remind you of the reality that many of us face if we live in rural communities or in communities where there has been inadequate and inequitable investment in broadband. I also want to say that I come from a community that values call and response. And I always try to make sure that I'm watching chat, even when I am presenting, because your acknowledgement of resonance in this presentation, your sharing of your own lived, either personal or or professional experience buoys me, and I think buoys the conversation, because it is my opportunity today to share in accepting this invitation, but I don't assume mastery, and I certainly don't assume that my knowledge or my narrative is the only knowledge or a body of knowledge or narrative that it is important to share in our coming together. So please feel free. And of course, at the end, we'll have an opportunity to talk together, for you to not only ask questions, but also to share your experience. And finally, I'm going to be asking Amelia to advance the slides for me, because I tend to gesticulate, and I am talking with you, can't see it because my hands are below the aperture for the camera, but I'm talking with my hands the entire way. So I really want to express my gratitude to Amelia. So I want to speak for a minute about what we see here, because these images are very intentional. Of course, what we're seeing here is Frederick Douglass, who was a noted abolitionist and suffragist in his day. And he was also had the experience of being enslaved, like many African Americans in this country. And in his enslavement, he was denied, like most enslaved Africans, the right to learn to read. And he was denied access to reading materials. When he became an abolitionist, when he escaped from bondage and dedicated himself to fighting for the freedom of his brothers and sisters, he really became, I think, the sort of influencer of his day. When we think about print media, he was considered in his day the most photographed man of his era, and that was intentional. He was always commissioning and sitting for photographs. He wanted people to see who he was, and he wanted often to be surrounded by maps and by books. So one, the photograph to the right bears one of his most famous quotes. Once you learn to read, you will be forever free. He was acknowledging, as I do, the connection between literacy and liberation, between learning to read and being able to read freely, to autonomy, agency, and socioeconomic mobility. But on the left, you see him reading. And I think that's something that he also wanted to ensure. He wanted to connect productivity and civic engagement and civic literacy to reading literacy, because he was not only committed to abolition and to the women's suffrage movement. He lived in Washington, D.C. in the Anacostia area, and he was very much committed to the building of D.C. and to D.C. being recognized as a epicenter of thought and leadership beyond politics, and he dedicated himself to that. So I just want to posit those notions in terms of being intentional about the use of Frederick Douglass's photograph. Next. So connected is this idea, I think, of literacy and liberation, that 2 years after the emancipation of most Black people in this country, and we know because of Juneteenth that manumission didn't reach everyone at the same time, but so connected were these ideas that in Harper's Weekly edition in 1867, there was an editorial that was connecting the fact that once Black people were beginning to learn to read in mass, that they would make further requests for political engagement and involvement and recognition beyond just simple freedom. And that is something I want us to think about. And I love this quote: "The alphabet is an abolitionist. If you would keep a people enslaved, refuse to teach them to read." And so I want us to think about that as we look at where we are today. And as we look at the ways in which we have normalized adult low literacy in some communities. Next, please. So as I mentioned, I live on the far south side of Chicago, and to the left is a map of the city. And if you were to imagine that sort of the blue body in the middle here is actually Lake Michigan, when you look north of Lake Michigan, and when you look south and west of Lake Michigan, you see a different story in terms of the outpicturing of COVID-19 deaths. So north in the city, where we have the majority of our investment downtown and north along the lake, you see relatively light boxes there. You see a light salmon, all the way to maybe a tomato red. When you begin to go south, you see block after block after block of dark burgundy, suggesting the reality that on the south and the west side of Chicago, there has been inordinate death because of COVID-19. And we'll talk a little bit more about why. But here, I wanted to share that where the American Library Association itself is based, our headquarters at least, in this city, where less than 50% of residents in many neighborhoods on the South Side, including mine, have access to reliable broadband, home devices, or even the digital skill set to not only consume, but to create content. The connection between COVID-19 awareness and prevention and information access is glaring. In fact, in June of 2020, 3 months after the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 a worldwide pandemic, our governor, J.B. Pritzker, acknowledged just 3 months later that one of the largest gaps in the city that was made even more significant in this pandemic is the digital divide. And there was already beginning to be a connection between COVID-19 infections and the fact that many people didn't have the opportunity to work remotely, and also didn't have the opportunity to use the internet to learn where they could get the very hard to access PPE if they were going to be exposed, if they were in frontline services, if they were working in service jobs, in grocery stores, in warehouses, those spaces that we relied on for many of us for delivery or for access points if we were ourselves able to work remotely. Next, please. So I wanted to also connect this conversation to North Carolina. So I wanted to think about the fact that we have begun to normalize disparity. And we've normalized disparity not only when it comes to digital access and digital literacy, but we've also normalized disparity when it comes to the very basic and fundamental right, which is the right to read, to learn to read. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is the fact that we haven't connected the achievement gaps that we see in schools, especially racialized achievement gaps, to a history of compulsory illiteracy, to a history that we have even exacerbated to now. Not only have we normalized low literacy to this day in some communities, we have also normalized the fact that we have very inadequate broadband to support small businesses, to support education, to support employment and employability. So I just wanted to say that in preparation for this conversation, I looked at what was happening in North Carolina and what the conversation has been around reading literacy and adult literacy, both K through 12, as well as beyond. And I know that this is an issue that many of you are not only facing, but I'm sure many of you are also combating in your work as practitioners in the LIS space or in education more broadly. Next, please. And I also wanted to just talk about the outcomes, right? It's one thing for us to talk about, what I'm going to give us a more of a history with in terms of compulsory illiteracy, but to think about the normalization of low literacy, I want us also to think about the outcomes. So I was looking at what was happening in Edgecombe County here, and I'd love to see. I'm going to pause for a minute if this is home to any of you. I'd love to see that, because I think that there's some really compelling work, I think, that is coming out of an organization called CREED, but really telling this story again of disparity and what this has meant. And of course, much of the data that we can pull from now is older data. So I'm looking forward to being able to compare it, because what we know is that there's been a slide decline, and some would say a very steep drop, if not more, in terms of what has happened with the education that has been interrupted due to COVID. So some of us are predicting that the disparity is going to be even greater. But if you look at just the data in terms of who's considered college ready, right? And if you look at degree attainment in the United States in general, for the comparison between Latin or Hispanic and white adults and Black and white adults, you see this story that also speaks to, I think, this persistence of public health outcomes in terms of disparity. You see that there are many who, no matter what we are facing, if there is a pandemic or a local crisis, there are some who will not have the education level to be hired in jobs that allow them to work in a hybrid fashion. Even in the midst of a real emergency or disaster. So there's more that we can say here. I really intend a lot of this data for you to extrapolate and to apply. But what I see here is both in obviously North Carolina, but also in the US, we are setting ourselves up to repeat the cycle that we have seen of connecting low literacy to low economic attainment to low public health outcomes. Next, please. So there's this idea, I think, of information disparity or information discrimination or information inequity, or something that I will explain that I call information redlining, that feels like it is contemporary, but the reality is that it is part of the fabric of the United States. What we know is that literacy has always been racialized. It has always been classed. It has always been gendered. And what we often, I think, fail to connect is the de jure of the law and de facto how we actually act of compulsory illiteracy and what that has meant around this notion of information as contraband. And what I want to posit is that we still live in an environment where information is considered contraband. Today, think about the fact that right at this moment, we have far surpassed the McCarthy era in terms of books that are banned, right? And we start with books that, of course, as McCarthy did in 1947, the books that were often considered to be Marxist or un-American were often books like Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, because people were reading civil disobedience in order to begin to organize around peaceful civil rights protests. Books that were banned, Robin Hood, because people were beginning even then to think about the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So Robin Hood was placed on the banned books list. And also works by Langston Hughes and W.B. Du Bois. W.B. Du Bois was writing about a Black middle class and how important that Black middle class would be to Black sovereignty and to Black agency and to the erection of Black community, and how you would need to have that middle class. And of course, Langston Hughes, who was almost run out of the country because Langston Hughes was writing poems about the ill effect of segregation. And we think about librarians like Ruth Boyd in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, a librarian who was dismissed from her job because she was promoting books in the library about integration, and that she had also begun to argue for the inclusion of Blacks as workers in the library. And in fact, later in protecting her and standing up for her, the entire board, trustee board of the library was dismissed and let go. And then another library board that had been, somehow appointed was put in its place to reinforce the status quo. Does this sound familiar? If it does, it is because history is repeating itself. And I think that there is so much more that we can say in connecting this notion about what it means to suppress the right to read and to suppress what people read, and also what it means to suppress agency, and also to the battle for political and economic inclusion. Next, please. So when we think about the de jure the de jure ways that we were seeing this country enforce compulsory illiteracy, we had the slave code laws. And in nearly all of the slaveholding states in the US and sometimes outside of them, there were harsh restrictions placed on reading and writing for Black people, and even instruction. In fact, instruction was one of the harshest punishments under the slave code laws that whites could face. So let me read this because this is something that I think we want to start with. And this is the city, we're talking about Savannah, Georgia, has passed an ordinance by which any person that teaches any person of color, slave or free, to read or write, or causes such persons to be so taught, is subjected to a fine of $30 for each offense. And every person of color who shall keep a school to teach reading or writing is subject to a fine of not only $30, but also imprisonment and corporal punishment, and can be whipped 39 lashes. Next, please. So lest we point to our neighbor in Georgia, I wanted to bring this notion of compulsory literacy home to North Carolina. And here is a bill in North Carolina to prevent all persons from teaching slaves to read or write. The use of figures, being able to add and subtract, was accepted. And that was because often enslaved Africans would be asked to ferry money back and forth, almost roving ATMs, if you would, or to make transactions. And so people wanted enslaved Africans who were charged with that work to be able to read and write, because of course, the person sending them didn't want to be cheated. But teaching someone to read the alphabet again was considered to be problematic. And here's why, according to North Carolina. Whereas the teaching of slaves to read and write has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion, to manifest injury of the citizens of the state. Therefore, and that's the justification, of course, for what we see on the right. So I just want us to think about some of the books that have been banned and the why. I want us to think very specifically of the math books that were banned in Florida. Why? Mostly because of social emotional learning, right? One of my great friends, one of my best friends from college, Dr. Nikki Newton, Newton, Roberta Monique Newton is her full name. She is out of Columbia, an EDD out of Columbia. And when I was becoming a librarian, she was becoming one of the premier math pedagogists in the country. And she certainly is that now, having written standalone math books, about 11 of them, but also having contributed to math textbooks in many states, including Florida. And because of having things like students will learn how to multiply by powers of 3, 4, and 5, and having the math language next to that language are things like students will be empowered when it comes to problem solving, or students will learn to listen as their peers explain their approach to problem solving. Those areas, the social and emotional learning components, were considered to be problematic, were considering to be off topic. And I want you to think about the fact that people oppressed people can sometimes be asked to become more numerate. And it's okay to have numeracy, but it's not okay to have full literacy. Do we see history repeating itself? It's okay for someone to contribute, financially or to that space, but not to learn to think for themselves. So I just see so many parallels, and I wanted to share that, and I wanted to bring it home to North Carolina. Next, please. Here is a very specific part of the North Carolina Code Law. In North Carolina, to teach a slave to read or write, or to sell him any book, I wanted to bring it home now to libraries. Bible not accepted. Bible not accepted, listen to that, or pamphlet is punished with 39 lashes or imprisonment if the offender be a free Negro, but if white, then with a fine of $200. Now, I've done some homework, and what I've been able to see is that $500 in this period here in the 1830s was tantamount to what today would be about $11,000. So when we think about a fine of $200, that was not a small amount of money at that point. The reason for this law, again, assigned in its preamble, is that teaching slaves to read and write tends to dissatisfaction in their minds and to produce insurrection and rebellion. So again, I wanted to bring it from not just the act of reading, but also books. Again. So I hope you can see and follow where I'm going and why I think this conversation, this forgotten part of our history that was not that long ago, is so compelling in light of the battles that we are facing in libraries today and what we are called to do. Next. So and this is from a book that I think has been really helpful to me in thinking about this argument and this line of inquiry that I've been pursuing for a few years of compulsory illiteracy. This is looking at public HBCUs or public Black colleges. And here the writer says, for nearly a century after freedom. So I wanted to contemporize it. So we're thinking about 1831, 1867, 1820, 1850. For nearly, though, a century, bringing it into the modern civil rights era, after freedom from enslavement and enforced illiteracy, the nation's answer to Black Americans' desire and enthusiasm for learning was consistent and pervasive discrimination. So again, I want to say that even though we can say, oh, well, that was a long time ago, because that's everybody's mantra. Well, that's not now. I didn't have anything to do with that. But the reality is that we begin to move those de jure ideas into de facto ideas, into other types of compulsory illiteracy and the persistent denial of equitable access when it comes to learning and reading. Next, please. So just as a reminder, and I know that many of us know this and are quite aware, but the earliest actions in the civil rights movement actually began in libraries. You even have people like the late Representative John Lewis, good trouble, himself, and one of Martin Luther King's most devoted proteges. He talks about how when he first heard King, he was so moved that he and some of his peers went back to their communities, and the first thing that they did was to seek to stage a sit-in in a library in their community. And he's from Troy, Alabama, that they had been denied to ever access. And again, even in 1946, et cetera, we begin to see that the most, I think, foundational protests were not happening at lunch counters. The earliest ones and the ones that I think began to get at one point some of the most traction were happening in libraries, and there's a whole history of that. And I think we have to confront that history, because I think libraries are always posited as these safe and equitable spaces. And I say we have to fight for that, right? Because that is not our natural inclination all the time. A lot of times the inclination has been to uphold the status quo. And where I really want to celebrate contemporary libraries today is that I see libraries, and most importantly, I see librarians and library staff fighting for intellectual freedom, fighting for equity, and being on the vanguard. And we must continue that. We cannot take it for granted, and we can't allow ourselves to kind of settle into complacency or silence, because I do think that libraries have a capacity to disrupt the persistent inequities that we see today, but only if we stand up, and only if we acknowledge that we must always choose to be on the right side of history and act accordingly. Next, please. So North Carolina itself has a history of both exclusion and inclusion, and I wanted to share that, because I think that there has been a history that I think even in North Carolina that our forebears have had to fight. So let me read this a bit. And this is on the battle to desegregate the nation's library. Here's a little excerpt about North Carolina. In states such as North Carolina, the survey showed a variety within the theme of exclusion. In the Appalachian mountain town of Marshall, there was no library segregation because there were so few Black people, period. In Greenville City, in the eastern part of the state, white borrowers picked from 62,000 circulating volumes, while African Americans chose from only 3,296. Near the South Carolina border, Rockingham County had white and Black libraries. And also, those Black libraries had Black staff, the latter who performed their clerical work at headquarters and attended meetings with white staff. All books were interchangeable, wrote the librarian William O'Shea. So here we see an integrated library. This was one supposes progress when Blacks and whites could share office space and books, while some libraries across North Carolina reported having janitors as their only African-American employees. O'Shea noted, "No Negro has been rejected for employment since I have been a librarian. We hired Negro teenagers to help put Main Library in order after a recent painting," he added in a penciled scrawl and without irony. The parenthetical reference that painting in white library was done by Negro painters. That line alone is something that I think that could be a dissertation right there. But what I want to say here is that, oh, I don't even need to say anything. I think you can get it. I think what I really want to point to is that we are still living a history about even disparity in not only reading and not only in terms of libraries, but also employment in libraries. So our fight then is a trifold one. But I really want to say one thing that I think is really important. Even today, those of you who might be working in public libraries or even in academic libraries, one of the things that I see so often, having visited so many libraries across the country, is I will often see that in the same library system, or even in a particular sort of university city system, if it's statewide, that often the library branches or the campuses that are in majority people of color communities are the least resourced and ill-equipped. And I want to say that, why do we have to continue to play that out again and again? If I can do nothing else with this talk, we have to interrupt that and we have to check ourselves. There is no justification for any library to be within the same system and have access to the same funding, for there to be a library that we have justified being ill-equipped, understaffed, and just poor in general. I mean, then we play into this cycle that we are desperately trying to not only break out of ourselves, but to lead our communities out of. So I want to stop there and see if that resonates. I just want to, because I think if nothing else, I want to make sure that that hits home. If that resonates for you, just, mention that in chat, because I see that so often that it really, sometimes it saddens me and sometimes it more so. So there. Thank you for those of you who are giving me a little bit of a witness there. All right, next, please. I do want to point to some efforts. This is one effort by an African-American sorority that was started in 1913, Delta Sigma Theta, that a Black librarian who was a part of that sorority was so incensed by, she was living up north in New York, and she was so incensed about de jure and de facto segregation in libraries down south that she encouraged her sorority sisters to contribute to a pool of funds. They bought a bus, they equipped it. She was the collection manager and developer, and they hired a driver and staff to work in cities across the South so that this bookmobile could be, and here's an example of it, could be driven across to give Black people in especially very rural Southern towns access to their only library, or access to a library if they were denied access to the main library or to the system itself. And so there are opportunities to disrupt the cycle. And I just want to call this out. In 1957, the American Library Association actually acknowledged Delta Sigma Theta for this work, because it is said that this little bus that you see, this orange and yellow bus, this red and yellow bus, actually reached hundreds of thousands of people across the South. And if a group of people could do this, what are we up to? What more can't we do? And thank you, Brianna Nunez. There are many, many books now that are talking about Jim Crow libraries, and we need more. And we also need more to talk about the history of compulsory illiteracy. Next, please. So the key points, as I fly through the rest here, I want us to think about information access and literacy as a social justice and a public health issue. I want us to think about and take up arms, if we will, in the fight against information poverty and low literacy. I want us to recognize that we are in the third great wave of library services. And finally, I want us to understand that closing the digital divide is part of closing the literacy divide, and that is the next wave of the civil rights movement. Next, please. So again, the very prescient Congressman John Lewis said that access to the internet is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. He said this shortly before he died, and I feel like he left that with us to hold. I have data here. On the left, there is a recent article in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, that connected, and I thought that this was really important, low literacy to higher risk when it comes to COVID-19 deaths. And in fact, I think that we are just sort of doing more and more research that connect the dots between reading literacy, digital literacy, and higher mortality. And that's something that we need to think about as we think about digital navigation systems, and how we think about libraries integrating literacy and fundamental digital literacy into our work. Because I too myself, when I was at Seattle, I was one of those trainers when it came to teaching people how to use personal computing. And I remember whole classes just on the mouse. Today, somebody comes in and they need that kind of help. We get frustrated. We're like, we can't sit here with you, but somebody needs to be able to pay attention to the fact that we have a very high percentage, sometimes as much as 23% of people who are not using the internet at all. And often that's because they don't feel equipped to. And finally, on the right, we see just a reification of the gaps that exist in digital space and broadband. Next, please. So the urgency of equity, and I see Brianna is holding her own study group in the chat. Go, Brianna. I want to say that one thing I want us to pay attention to is a major study that came out in September 9th, 2020. I saw this study, just a little bit of it published in the Wall Street Journal, and I was so upset that I had to reach out to the senior economist who wrote the study for Deutsche Bank, Abjad Walia, and speak with him because I felt like some of the data points were so concerning. And especially in my new role at the American Library Association, I started just a couple of weeks before the pandemic. But because this has been my line of study and writing and my area of practice in libraries, I felt like I was seeing something play out that many of us have been trying to warn the field and others about for a very long time. But these data points, I think, are critical. One of the things that he talked about, and all of this is about digital literacy and digital access. He says that Black and Latinos are, we know this, are 10 years on average behind their white peers in terms of broadband access. And that that when it comes to Black communities in particular, Black individuals have much poorer tech connectivity than their white peers. We also know, and I shared this before, that one of the reasons why we had such a great toll on Black and Latino life as a result of and Indigenous and AAPI death because of COVID-19 is because many people were not employed at a level that they could work in a hybrid fashion. That many people needed to be not only on the front line, but in places where, especially like in grocery stores and other things, but they would be coming in contact with many people. And of course, we know in the early days of the pandemic, people either were or were not masking, et cetera. So, but what we see is that Black people alone had to leave their homes 135% more often than their white peers. These two data points on the right are things for us to think about. More than half, according to the study, of Black and Latinos could be underprepared for 86% of jobs by 2045 if more isn't done to support digital literacy. And that if this digital gap, if this racialized digital gap is not addressed, we could see the countries, I say majorities, ethnic and racial majorities, we could see them placed in an unemployment abyss. So I think that these are things that for me were alarming. But when I did talk to Dr. Walia, he said that in fact, we could expect that the gaps would have worsened because this was in the early stage, remember September of 2020, and didn't take into consideration the lethal blow, of course, that Omicron would play last year. Next. So I want to talk about information poverty as we get ready to close. I think that information poverty is something that is hidden in plain view. Johannes Britz, who is up there at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has described information poverty as a situation in which individuals and communities within a given context do not have the requisite, and I wanted to use this definition because it really breaks it down. He talks about skills, abilities, or material means. Even with ARPA, which, you know, the American Library Association, we fought for libraries and for broadband to be included and considered infrastructure, which was an amazing victory. And I think we all need to acknowledge that for the first time, infrastructure was more than trains and highways and those kinds of things. And now we consider information infrastructure. So that was a victory that we wanted to fight, and so happy that we won. But we are still focusing on the material means. What he talks about is also skill and ability. And I think that means that have digital broadband without investing in digital skill sets is really like having cereal with no milk, right? And then he talks about we also need to have efficient access to information, which is a lot of times where we park in libraries, but we also need to ensure that individuals have the ability to interpret it and also to apply it. And I think what he's speaking of here is something that I believe is that application is the zenith of information access. We don't park at access. We must think about application, and libraries must do more to ensure the application of information, not just the being there of information. Further, information poverty is defined by the lack of visible access points to critical information and the absence of well-coordinated and appropriately scaled information infrastructure. So before I move on, I just want to see, is that resonating for everyone? Okay, great, that's good. Next, please. So this is a slide that I'm going to ask you all to look at a little bit later, but this is a reification. So before I'm talking about information poverty, and I'm talking about the ways in which we as practitioners or researchers can begin to think about it and plan for it. But here is an example of what individuals, of what our users and would-be users and our non-users are saying about their own skill set. The National Skill Coalition, any of you who are working in collection development or you're planning education classes in libraries or just programming in general, would do well to look at the research that comes out of the National Skill Coalition so that we can begin to really curriculum our programs, not just think of a good program to have that another library does, but to think about our users and what their needs are. I think the National Skill Coalition does a really good job. And one thing that they say is that 33% when polled themselves, and you see an example in the middle of workers say that they don't feel that they have the adequate digital skill set to move into other jobs or to remain employed in their current jobs if circumstances change or if the need for digital literacy is included in their job more so. And we also see from the Pew Trust to the right, we get a chance to see who's not on the internet. And I also think that if I had an opportunity, we could parallel that to studies that show who does not use the library. I think that you can see a lot of synergy between those two charts. Next, please. And I'm reading Kate. I feel like my career has been a struggle to provide visible access points within systems that, oh my goodness. Yes. Here's, and I think this might be my last chart that I want to show you because I always over prepare. And now I just want to hear what you have to say. And if you have something to say, then maybe I'll have a slide to go to it. But I just want us to think about what literacy means in the United States. And I also want you to look at where you are. We're living now in a time where 1 out of 5 adults, and in some cases, 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 3 adults is not fully literate, meaning that they may be able to read, but they're not able to read with enough comprehension to apply the information. And I worked in social services before I became a librarian, and I worked with youth and youth homeless centers. And I tell you, there would be sometimes we would sit in the courthouse for the reunification of a family, and the parents are just so desperate to have the child back in their home. They found a home and they are excited by it. And you sit in there, you and the child are looking at each other, parent doesn't come, and they're upset, you're upset. And then later you find that the parent had a paper in their hand giving them these elaborate instructions of where to go in a courthouse. They made it to the courthouse, but felt too embarrassed to ask someone, especially after being waved off by some folks, of where to go. And I think, there's a lot that I could say about the ways in which we have both normalized literacy, but also begun to write and construct information, provide information at these really high levels that compounds low levels of literacy, if you get what I'm saying. But if you look at this map, and if you read over to the left, there is work to do. I'll just mention 72% of children whose parents have low literacy skills will likely be at the lowest reading levels themselves. There's a direct correlation between low literacy and poverty. If we want to get at the heart of generational poverty, we need to get at the heart. We need to get to the root of generational low literacy. 61% of low-income families have no children's books in their homes. Libraries, when we're giving away books or having our book sales, can we begin to package some of the children's books and give them to families? There's some things that we can do. Some low-tech things that we can do. So next, please. This is, again, this is Brunswick County. I just wanted to give you an idea of what's happening in just one community in North Carolina. Next. Again, North Carolina's literacy gaps. I just want you to look at just maybe two coupled areas, and you can see a direct correlation, as I've said, between those who lack basic literacy skills and people who live below the poverty line. It's almost like a one-to-one correlation. Next, please. Information redlining. I believe redlining, we know what redlining is by now. That phrase was coined here at the University of Chicago and is found in the Encyclopedia of Chicago. I've written some articles now for a few of our journals on information redlining. This is a phrase that I've coined. So if you have a problem, you can let me know, and I'm always learning. I believe that information redlining is a systematic denial of equitable access to information, information services, and information retrieval methods. And I think that that is something that we have to be very purposeful about eradicating and recognizing the ways in which libraries themselves and our policies and protocols can redouble this if we're not careful. Next. Thanks, Carl. So I believe we're on the front lines of what I think is the third great wave of library services. First great wave was during the Carnegie era and the building of libraries. We were kind of building libraries like Starbucks, right? We were building libraries when less than 1 in 5 adults were fully literate. We were normalizing literacy with the building of libraries. So libraries have always been about social change, education, and disruption. Today, I believe we're on the third great wave of literacy. Of library services. The second was introducing personal computing in the ways in which like grants like from Gates and others really brought a lot of that education to libraries. The third great wave is going to have to be about digital literacy and about taking our services outside of the library. We have to have the library because of the erosion of public space. And we need spaces where people can come together, but we want to make sure that our services are more integrated into the community as well, or into the campus, into the school, et cetera. So I feel like now I just want to see what your questions are. So I'm going to park it here. You can move on as you get ready for your questions. I believe that we're seeing simultaneous disinvestment in libraries as well as in communities. I pair them. You can go on here. You can go on, and I'm just gonna, everyone know I'm coming to you for questions. I think that the American Library Association, part of, if you're an ALA member, we take a pledge. We have 12 core values that we have to uphold. Access, confidentiality, democracy, diversity, education and lifelong learning, intellectual freedom, sustainability, the public good, preservation, professionalism, service, social responsibility. So it really takes it from just being a practitioner to saying, this is what we're working for to create. And at ALA, if you look at the next slide, thank you, Amelia, for your support. We are working for universal broadband. The council in January of 21 voted for a fee-free internet, said that universal broadband must be considered a human right. So that pushed us as an association to really begin to fight for universal broadband. I had the opportunity to speak before the FCC with 12 internet service providers in attendance, most of the big ones, if not all of the big ones. And I said just that. And I also spoke about compulsory illiteracy and the connection between digital literacy. I was scared, but I had to say it. That was my shot. And I was shocked at the support and the resonance with which these ideas landed. And we're also fighting for additional funding to broaden library and information access. We have to have strong libraries if we are going to do this work. This is a great slide to park on and let me hear from you. And I want to thank you all for your patience. As you can see, my goal is to ensure that as we leave this place, each of us and all of us find a place for our work and our passion in this struggle for equitable access.
Tracy, thank you so much. This was amazing. And as you can see from the chat and the questions, it's generated a lot of thought and support and just a lot of energy around this whole topic. Please, I think people have added questions in the Q&A Also, some folks submitted questions in advance. One I will start with, and then we can move to other questions. Tracy, there was a question about how library schools should adapt their curriculum to help new librarians, face these challenges and, and work more intentionally to address these issues.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I do think that a lot of LIS programs have turned more to informatics, and I'm a graduate of the I School at the University of Washington, so I was one of those students. But I do think that we want to always be thinking about user experience, usability, and I think more so we have to begin to integrate more education courses as well into the curriculum. I certainly took a lot of education courses. I had the opportunity to do that with my degree. But I do think that we need to understand just the baselines of education and educational access, because in libraries, that's what we do. And so I think that would be one recommendation.
Thank you. There was the question in the Q&A, curious about the slide about NC library inclusion and exclusion. Roughly when was the survey done where Rockingham County librarians said all books were interchangeable?
Yeah, that is one of the things that I'll need to share with you later, because there's two things that are being referenced there. There's a survey that they did that was obviously sometime during the civil rights era, right? Because they're talking about libraries that are beginning to either integrate in some ways or not. And so what's unclear for me right now is, but also to the larger study, is a longitudinal study. It's sort of looking at North Carolina libraries and other libraries in the South in relief. So if you email me at thall@ala.org, I'll go back and try to suss that out for you. But I think we can take it that that the survey that was taken during I would say the civil rights era. So sometime in the 50s, it would seem.
Another question with regard to the concept of information poverty, could we expand that to apply to the entirety of the American public, and how we are given a distinctly curated feed of propaganda veiled in the form of indisputable fact?
Yeah, so I think that there's definitely a larger canopy about information policy we have to think about. I might distinguish, if I just had to, I might distinguish disinformation and misinformation from information poverty, because I think when we think about information poverty, if you think about work by Elfrida Chapman and John Agata, we're talking about environments that just really don't have adequate information access in general, let alone disinformation or misinformation. But to connect them, absolutely. I think we have to connect them.
There was also a question about books you might recommend, and the person who asked the question to the Black librarians and libraries had to leave, but I'm wondering if you might, if you can share a list of books that you might recommend, maybe with Amelia, we could get it out. We could maybe get suggestions out to folks.
Sure. And I would say that in addition to books, there's a lot of books that are being written more and more about segregation and Jim Crow era in libraries. But I would say that there are a lot of dissertations and a lot of maybe scholarly papers that I think are just really interesting when it comes to things around closer to information policy and inequity. And I tend to read a lot of scholarship around that too, from journals and things like that. So I've always tried to integrate the reading of journals in the field. There is, there definitely is that opportunity for those of us who work in libraries to kind of learn more about information policy and information theory, and I enjoy that.
What gives you hope, Tracy, around the digital divide, the urgency of equity that is so troubling?
Yeah, I think what gives me hope is the field. I mean, I see when I get a chance to see what library practitioners are doing, when I get a chance to see what educators are doing, and when I get a chance to see what activists are doing, I mean, I know that I think it's our default to want to do better and continuous improvement. And I do know, and I've seen, you know, the last couple of years in particular, that when there have been some of the gravest issues around injustice, folks who from everywhere, from around the world, will come together and stand up, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Awesome. Well, we're at our time. There was a question about ALA lobbying Congress to classify the internet as a public utility. I don't know if you might quickly address that before we go, if there are any lobbying efforts that are underway.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see that over the last few years, ALA has always had a real strength in its advocacy. And, you know, one of those things that we take, you know, for granted is, you know, ALA has argued, you know, at the level of the Supreme Court for privacy. And I think that we have done a really good job in the 90s in fighting for a ubiquitous internet, right? And also fighting for a low E-rates. Now that the next era in that fight is going to be free broadband and free internet access. And I think that we're going to fight that methodically, but I do believe that there's going to be a time in the next decade or so where we're going to look back and remember that we once paid for the internet, and that will no longer be the case. And I think ALA will have a lot to do with making that happen.
Great. Well, thank you, Tracy, again, and many kudos in the chat. I hope you noticed this was just wonderful and inspiring and energizing.
Thank you. Thank you all, and everyone. Keep up the amazing work. North Carolina is one of the epicenters for practice in the country. So continue the great work, and we will all remember where we've come from and remind ourselves of where we must go to serve our communities. So thank you for your excellence.